But the talking point then, as they mocked me for being an ignorant comedian who doesn't really understand geopolitics, what they were running with 3 days ago was America isn't at war. You're just letting Israel take care of business. What's your problem, Dave?
So recently, Dave Smith had a podcast where he talks about the shifting goalposts when it comes to the war between Iran and Israel, with the U.S. supporting Israel, and how the war propaganda evolved over time, even in such short distances of time. We went essentially from Israel's doing this on their own, and then 24 hours later, it was regime change is cool, and now we're looking at a potential ceasefire. But I want to hear what Dave says, and let's watch and let's react.
You criticize us when we fight other people's wars, but now you're also criticizing us when we just let Israel conduct its own war. And by the way, they've completely taken out the Iranian nuclear program. You remember that, Rob? This was their talking point after Israel's strike, that Israel is so badass, they have decapitated the nuclear weapons that Iran does not have. And that, and of course, right after that, Donald Trump attacks. Now, when Donald Trump attacks, they say, that's it now. Now, this was the really successful one. Israel did just about everything, but Donald Trump, we got these bunker busters and the might of the American military. We just needed to drop a couple bunker busters. That's all that happens. The rest Israel will handle, all of this. Donald Trump then sends all of his people out to do the Sunday shows. He's got all his guys going out. They're all saying this is a one and done strike. There's no regime change here. This is not about a regime change. This was never a regime change war. Then all day that day, I got everybody, all the hawks on Twitter going, see, Dave, you're arguing as if this is a regime change war. Then Donald Trump announces he wants regime change.
Yeah, he basically implied that in no uncertain terms using the phrase itself. So this propaganda shifted even over a 24-hour period. It was, well, Israel's just doing this on their own. This isn't a war. To, well, Trump bombed them, but it was enormously successful and it was good. To, regime change is a good thing. And now today we have a ceasefire. So you can see how the goalposts continued to shift over time. And now people are saying, the same people that are saying, regime change, like Donald Trump said, and this bombing was successful, are now, celebrating the ceasefire. And I am too, in a way. I think this outcome is far better than some of the nightmare scenarios. There are ramifications from it that are negative, though. This pushes Russia closer to China. This killed innocent Israelis and Iranians that didn't have to be involved in this struggle. And it really proved neocons wrong about what the Iranian regime was willing to do, because you didn't see them try to wipe Israel off the map. They did do strikes against Israel and did sub damage, but they didn't unleash their full weaponry. They didn't attack U.S. troops in any realistic way that would have damaged them. In fact, they tipped off Trump to their retaliation strike ahead of time. That seemed to have been just a domestic, inward-facing, face-saving measure. So there's so many things about this where the war propaganda kept shifting just to, emulate whatever Trump wanted to do at the time. And no matter what, he was going to be viewed as a legend in the people that supported this size.
That's the next step. Now they're all arguing why regime change is good. The same thing that they told you yesterday you were stupid for believing, they'll now tell you not only is it true, but it's a great thing that it's happening. By the way, after the U.S. strike, Israel then picked up their strikes, and they're bombing non-nuclear targets, just regime targets. Prisons filled with political enemies of the Iranian regime, different, strategic, targets of strategic value for the regime that have absolutely nothing to do with nuclear sites. So again, it's just like with all these things, it's unbelievable the levels of dishonesty that the war hawks are capable of. Like it's something that still to this day, it's like when you just talk to a complete liar, there's something jarring about it, but they will argue with you, get you dragged into arguing this point. And then when you are proven right the next day, they just abandon it like it never happened and move on to the next talking point about why you're stupid for not supporting the war. It is just, I don't know, man. It's unbelievable to witness.
And that's the same as what we saw during the COVID regime. Remember, it started with 2 weeks to slow the spread or 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And then it was these 6-foot measures that, according to Fauci himself, came out of nowhere. He said that in congressional testimony just last year, I believe. And then they went into, religious worship restrictions, assembly rights restrictions, closed down businesses, imposed curfews. You had stay-at-home orders where people woke up and listened on the radio or checked the internet to see whether they were allowed to leave their homes that day. Relatives dying alone in hospitals. You had all this stuff as the world broke down, and each time the goalpost would move, they never had to apologize for any of it. You were a conspiracy theorist if you saw any of that coming, and you proved to be right. And there was never an apology. There was never prosecutions against the villains that did that. It's the same thing with these warmongers that consummate these military operations to the detriment of the United States and even its stated foreign policy goals, which was to negotiate with Iran. Trump's not going to apologize for that. Oh, I guess, Israel's strike can just undermine what we were looking for with Iran. Now, I'm glad that the worst case scenario didn't happen. No U.S. forces in that region died, and that's fantastic. But innocents on both sides died. And if you believe in the value of human life and non-intervention, you have to stress out about that. Nothing positive really came from this. Netanyahu's going to continue to plead for regime change, talk about how they're close to a nuclear weapon in years to come. And I don't see this going away anytime soon. And we know that Israel has a record of breaking ceasefires. They just did that in Gaza, by the way. So there's few sure things about this, but the worst case scenario hasn't unfolded as of yet, and that's a good thing.
At this point, someone was arguing with me the other day, and they said, something of like, how, look, dude, it just like, we cannot take the threat of a regime enriching to 60% uranium or something about that. And it's like, yeah, but just think about like the fucking incentive structure that you've created here. Like if this regime does survive, which is quite possible. And if this regime does survive, you're like, okay, so you're telling me that for all the regime changes that America has had you ever see like where they list all the regime changes the U.S. has had like post World War II, where it's like all the regime changes through direct war or CIA covert actions or colored revolutions or whatever. It's just like a long list. I think we're at like 70 something nations that we've overthrown. None of them have had nukes. We do not overthrow nuclear armed regimes because it's just, even for these guys, it's just too risky. So you're telling me we will, if you completely abandon your nuclear ambitions like Gaddafi, we'll overthrow you. If you develop nukes, we won't overthrow you. If you hang around at 60%, that's high enough, we'll overthrow you. So like, it's like the incentive is just so obvious. You're creating the incentive for more people to try to obtain nuclear weapons.
This is the best point he's making here. This is the worst ramification of this because the U.S., if it didn't do so already, and it did, as Dave said, in Libya, and how it treats North Korea in comparison to Libya, every country is now incentivized to acquire a nuclear weapon. Why wouldn't you? The U.S. and Israel won't mess with you in that case. Iran was actually willing to negotiate a plan for a nuke-free Middle East. Israel's not, of course, because Israel has a secret nuclear weapons program. They won't admit that, but they do have them. They got them from the Americans, and they don't want to subject themselves to IAEA restrictions and inspections and things like that. But Israel always wanted a nuke-free Middle East, and I would too. But if they can't have that, which they're not going to get because of how much the Israel lobby controls the United States, why wouldn't they now, especially now, develop a nuclear weapon? The U.S. and Israel practically told them you should develop a nuclear weapon. That's one of the biggest ramifications of all this, and I wouldn't be surprised if they would. And by the way, both the IAEA and U.S. spokesmen confirmed that they haven't accounted for where Iran's uranium actually is. Now, Trump said this bombing was a stunning success and he destroyed some of the facilities with 30,000-ton bombs, but there isn't account for where the uranium actually is, which they need for their nuclear power program. So we'll have to see where that goes too.
And worse than that, and this feels a lot like a lot of what I'm seeing feels like the propaganda I've seen before. So if you remember the Ukraine propaganda, it was Biden refused to say that NATO will not, Ukraine won't be a part of NATO but then also pretended like we're not escalating the situation here. And so on the same note, they keep floating this this talking point of, well, they enriched all the way to 60%. But then also the 60% is not really the problem. From what I understand, they were willing to go back to just being allowed to enrich uranium. But then the Donald Trump, they said, you guys can't enrich uranium at all, while then pretending that the issue is over the 60% enrichment. And it's like, that wasn't the fighting point. If anything, they went to the 60% to be within breakout range of having some sort of a nuclear deterrent, which, speaking to your point, this new environment would suggest don't be within range. Make sure that you're either fully there or not doing it at all, because being within range, you're going to be treated as if you have it without actually having the deterrent.
Yeah, and he's right about the negotiations. They did start with no nuclear enrichment, which requires about 90% enrichment. But then at some point, that delegation shifted from that to no uranium enrichment. And that was just a dead letter. That was a non-starter poison pill. I've talked about this in other videos, but that was never going to be accepted by the Iranians. The Iranians never shifted their position on this. They wanted to negotiate with the United States, come up with a new JCPOA type plan. But the U.S. shifted their plans, it seems like, because they were in on this strike plan with Netanyahu. So that's what happened. Robbie's right.
Yeah, that's right. And just to be clear, I mean, I know I've said this on some other podcasts, but so like they were also, it should be pointed out that Iran was in compliance with the JCPOA, because the way the deal was worked, right? Like the deal still exists. The deal was between like Europe, America, and Iran. But the way the deal was written was that if America pulls out of the deal, then they're allowed to enrich up to 60%. So that's what they did. America pulled out and they went, okay, well then we're going to exercise our option to enrich up. But they still have the inspections regime. They still have inspectors coming in. That's how we know that they're at where they're at. That's actually what the Hawks are using against them, is the reports coming back from the inspection regime that still is operating in Iran.
Yeah, how ironic is that they make judgments based on these inspections reports that are happening toward their uranium enrichment process, but that doesn't happen toward Israel's uranium enrichment process, because there's a secret program that they won't reveal and they won't even talk about.
And so, and also they are on record saying, we will get back into the original JCPOA if America wants to come back into it. So they're sitting there negotiating. Essentially, they've admitted that we enriched all the way up to have something to negotiate away. That's what they were. That was the Iranian perspective in these negotiations, and this has been widely reported. It's like they were going like, "Hey, look, we'll come back down to our enrichment levels, and you drop some of the sanctions against us." Like they were trying to negotiate back into the deal that we already had before Donald Trump decided to walk away from it. It's just all, Anyway, so this idea that because they're enriched, and look, all of this other stuff where even Tulsi Gabbard selling her soul and coming out and going, they could be weeks away, directly contradicting her testimony from just a couple months ago, and even the intelligence she was putting out just a couple weeks before that. Now they're saying they could be days away or weeks away. This is a completely new talking point, just invented after this war broke out.
Yeah, that's so true. Tulsi she did contradict her testimony. 6 weeks ago, she said in the annual threat report, Iran isn't developing a nuke, and there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest they've restarted that program. And then the day before these U.S. strikes came, well, they're weeks away from developing the nuke. Well, even Netanyahu and Mossad didn't go that far, where they said weeks away. Netanyahu said 1 year away in an interview that happened after the first Israeli strike. So this seems to have just been war propaganda. She got her arm twisted by someone in the Israel lobby or someone in the military industrial complex. That's just the truth.
It was not a talking point 5 minutes before Israel bombed Iran. Even Benjamin Netanyahu, after he launched the initial attack, in his interview with Brett Baer, said maybe a year, maybe 13 months. But of course, Rob, and this is some of the stuff Thomas Massey is getting at, and we talk a little bit about that too. Of course, if you have a year, then what does that mean? There's plenty of time to debate the issue in Congress. Right. This isn't a situation where there's some pending emergency and the president has to strike. It's like, no, he could bring this to Congress, bring all of the evidence. This is the way our constitutional system supposedly was set up to work, is that the people's representatives in the Congress would get to make a decision on behalf of the people, looking at the evidence. Do we think that this threat, whatever.
Yeah, and there's a collaboration between the executive branch and the legislators. The legislators don't make a fuss that much about war, except for a few like Massey and Khanna and Marjorie Taylor Greene and some others that did oppose this, and rightfully so. And the executive, they just kind of let the executive run free in terms of foreign policy, just bomb whatever targets you want. We won't say anything, and then in return, the president doesn't bring it to Congress and make them have to explain to their constituency why they're supporting it. So it's just a plague that's happened. It's a bipartisan phenomenon in the U.S. in recent decades.
But of course, none of them want to do that. So they just launched an illegal war of aggression. Why not? That's good enough. The Israelis say so. That's good enough. Good enough for Trump. I understand. People were saying basically that they were criticizing me of creating a framework where I'm right no matter what happens. And I kind of get that. I understand someone saying like, hey, you're saying you're going to be right if this happens or right if it doesn't happen. But my point was just that, like, look, there's only so many possibilities here. We will see how this all ends. But essentially what I was saying was like, what I'm praying for now, this is after Trump's strike. You go like the best case scenario here is that Iran really does just take this like a bitch, like that they really do just take this, kind of wave the white flag, I knew they had to like respond in some way, but maybe they do one of these like, pretend responses like they did with Israel.
That's exactly what they did. This was recorded shortly before that happened, but it was a pretend response. They launched missiles that really didn't have a chance of actually doing damage to U.S. vessels. They were shot out of the air, and Trump himself revealed that Iran tipped him off to that strike. So this was a domestic, inward-facing, face-saving operation designed to produce some kind of retaliation, quell people's concerns within Iran, but not do the damage. And how telling is that, by the way? This entity that, the Israel lobby and the neocons have said is this genocidal maniac regime that wants to destroy the world, would destroy Israel tomorrow, death to America. They want to destroy all of American troops in the region. They didn't behave in that way whatsoever. So I think that's very telling, too.
After Israel killed their guy in Syria there, and they gave the U.S. warning and then sent a bunch of missiles that were all shot down and didn't really kill anyone. And they've already done a little bit more than that in Israel this time, and they've killed some people. But like maybe the response would be something like that again, something like the post-Soleimani response where they send some missiles at American bases but don't actually kill anybody or something like that. But so like, what we're hoping for now, we're in a position where we are relying on Iranian restraint. This is the position that the hawks have brought us to. We're counting on the mullahs to not do something crazy.
Which, by the way, they predicted that they will be crazy, and they weren't. But Dave's right. They were pushed into that corner that they didn't need to be, and innocents died over it. All for this fruitless and senseless, what's being called as a 12-day war with Iran. Dave is so right here.
And I was just making the point that, look, the best case scenario here is that nothing, like they do that, they puss out, they don't have a real response to this, and then somehow Donald Trump is able to say, look, I'm so great, we hit him, we walk away, it doesn't lead to a wider war. But I was just making the point that if that happens, and then, people will undoubtedly, say, oh, you guys were alarmists on this, or you got it all wrong. You were talking about what a catastrophe this has been, but look, it didn't turn out to be that bad of a thing. But I was saying if that is the case, then really, even though people are going to say, oh, you were alarmists, the real takeaway from that would be that it disproves the entire foundation of the Hawks argument here.
Right.
Like if the whole argument is that, yes, obviously I mean, at least the ones who aren't lying through their teeth will go, yes, Israel has secret nukes. Secret nukes aren't really the big problem. The big problem is the mullahs can't get nuclear weapons. Sure, Kim Jong-un has nuclear weapons. Sure, Joseph Stalin had nuclear weapons. Mao Zedong had nuclear weapons. Like some of the worst people who have ever existed in the history of the world. In fact, say the worst people who have ever existed in the history of the world had nuclear weapons, okay? But no. I know India has nuclear weapons, Pakistan has nuclear weapons, no. But if Iran gets nuclear weapons, cannot be allowed to happen. Like nobody ever suggested that we just launch a war of aggression against Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union because he was pursuing nuclear weapons, even though it was Joseph Stalin. You know what I mean? Like, even though it's like a guy who's already committed genocides.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can see the modern example is North Korea. I mean, Kim Jong-un has nuclear weapons. So the Kim dynasty has had nuclear weapons for quite a while, and the U.S. doesn't treat them as just this entity that we can just overthrow, willy-nilly antagonize like this, random strikes on behalf of whatever lobby wants to take him out. It doesn't because of that nuclear deterrent. We don't want to start a nuclear war. No one really does except for the most neocon of neocons. And even they'll admit that sometimes. So, yeah, Dave's totally right. It's not enough that a power has nuclear weapons. They have to be on the brink of it over time. And it's been over 30 years that Netanyahu's been accusing them of being on the brink of it. So they have to be locked into that place for this war propaganda to play out and work. And that's what you saw.
Mao Zedong killed more people than any human being who's ever lived. And yet nobody suggested the response to him having a nuclear research program was to launch an aggressive war against China. Nobody suggested that we preemptively strike India or Pakistan. So my point is that the whole case for the Hawks rests on this kind of unfalsifiable assertion that Iran with nukes will destroy the world. It's just, this is a risk we cannot tolerate. But if Iran takes this and doesn't do anything major in response, doesn't that just disprove the whole thing? Because the only reason they wouldn't do that is because, like all of those people, as bad as all of them are, as bad as Mao and Stalin, and as bad as like all these people throughout history have been, one of the things that they have in common that makes them kind of human is they like being in power and they like being alive. And they don't want to die. They do have self-preservation. They don't. And so Iran, obviously, not just now or today, even before these strikes, Iran could do a lot of damage to Israel or our bases in the region, but they don't want to do that because they know what'll happen then.
And Dave's a prophet here. This was recorded before he knew about the strike, but this is exactly what happened. They didn't behave so erratically and, aggressively in their retaliation, which it was retaliation. News articles and corporate media wouldn't call it a retaliation. They called it aggression or attacks when it was truly Israel that attacked Iran first. But that's exactly what this is. Now, the neocons, in the hypothetical world that they were right, Iran would have attacked Israel first before this strike by Israel. Israel's strike was first in this war. But the neocons would have been right in a hypothetical world in which Iran did act aggressive toward Israel, bombed them first, took out immense amounts of buildings because, they wanted to wipe it off the map and all the propaganda you heard about it. But they didn't do that. They retaliated in a way that was essentially impotent, but not impotent in the way that they couldn't have done more damage. They chose not to do more damage. So this is exactly what played out, disproving the neocons. So, in the hypothetical world that the neocons were painting, that isn't how this played out.
Okay, well, what happens if they nuke someone else? Everybody knows. Nobody doesn't think that if Iran had a nuke and then used it offensively, that the country wouldn't be destroyed as a result of it. The problem is just then you're at nuclear war, but everyone knows they'd be blown off the map.
Yeah.
They'd be obliterated, as Hillary Clinton threatened to do. It's so if it is survival that dictates their restraint, then that disproves the whole goddamn point. Okay? And then my other point was that if they do respond and they do end up like killing some Americans, and then we have to respond to that, and then the situation escalates, well, then we're at this tremendous risk of another disaster. And so people could say, oh, I'm creating a situation where I'm right no matter what. But like, I'm just saying, argue with the point there. We didn't have to do this. And now the best case scenario is Iran doesn't do anything major in response, which disproves the Hawks' entire position. Or what I got to say, I think is the more likely scenario here is that they do something in response. And now we got dead Americans, or now we got a wider war, all for something we didn't have to do to begin with. So yes, I guess I'm proven right in both scenarios, but I'm sorry, like, make an argument about why either one of those is wrong. It just seems so obvious. This is clearly, you enter a war of choice, and there's two options here, essentially, broadly speaking, and both of them disprove the Hawks' own talking points.
Yeah, Dave's totally right here. I'm glad that the better scenario happened. A ceasefire, it's not perfect. There's a lot of negative ramifications of it. But Iran struck back in a way that didn't do a lot of damage. Missiles shot out of the air, and now there's this ceasefire agreement. And I believe it's been confirmed by Iranians at the point in which I'm recording this now. And yeah, we got a better outcome than could have been, but there are also a lot of negatives to it. Who's going to want to negotiate with the United States in good faith now? This whole episode shows we negotiate in bad faith. It's not the first time that's happened. In Minsk 2, for instance, with Russia, that wasn't exactly, a good faith conversation and good faith negotiation. Ukraine had always intended to violate that and not grant the Donbas provinces autonomy as they were claiming they would. But it also puts Russia more into a bond with China. Why wouldn't you, if you're Russia, move more closely in an alliance with China, another nuclear superpower and probably the world's biggest one outside of Russia and the United States? I think it actually is, for sure. And, now we have jeopardization of the peace process in Ukraine to the semblance that Trump still wants that. I mean, he surrounded himself with Lindsey Graham and Keith Kellogg and Marco Rubio in those negotiations with both Ukraine and in negotiations with Russia. So who knows how long that'll continue. That's escalated a few times, but status quo territorial wise, Russia still occupies most of the Donbass. That hasn't changed in essentially 2 years. There's been some palpitations, including in the summer of 2024, but not much lately. That's going to jeopardize that. And the biggest thing Dave brought up is this is going to guarantee that other countries around the world and Iran are unlimitedly incentivized to pursue nuclear weapons. How wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? It doesn't make sense. They saw what happened to Gaddafi. They saw what happened in this episode. And now it looks like there's going to be a ceasefire, and for now, not a regime change. Now, the neocons will still beg for it. The Mark Levins and Ben Shapiro's of the world are drowning in their sorrows right now at the bottom of a Jack Daniels bottle because they're so despondent about this. This wasn't the outcome the neocons wanted, which was regime change. That's what they'll continue to call for, and Netanyahu will call for, and you're going to see this over and over in the years to come. So now Americans just have to hope that we never have a president willing again to yield to Israel's demands, but push it further this time. What if some escalation happens and that time it's pushed further? That's not what we want. The U.S. should negotiate directly with the Iranians on a JCPOA-like agreement without any input from the Israelis. That's what should happen. That would keep us out of a struggle with them. Plus, Israel wouldn't have the pretext that they just used to launch this war with a complicit United States. So that's what I think. Dave was largely right. I'm so glad that the worst scenario didn't unfold here yet, but there's a lot of lingering questions, and a lot of it isn't good, but the worst case scenario didn't happen. No U.S. servicemen dead, and that's a good thing. So thank you all for praying and thinking of them, but innocent Israelis and Iranians died over this, and that's tragic. Didn't need to happen. This was senseless, but I want to hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments below. Are you happy with the ceasefire arrangement? Did you notice the shifting goalposts in the run-up to this and the propaganda to support it? I want to hear from you on that. And I also want to say, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, consider becoming a YouTube member or a Patreon patron to support me, and I'd really appreciate that. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. I'll catch you in the next one.